Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We have the holidays in full swing right now, so we're all preparing for that. We have some family gatherings coming up, and we have a member of the Crawlspace family on this episode. He's always bringing such interesting insight into these topics. But Tim, how's your holiday season? Are you feeling jolly? Dish, what's going on?
I'm jolly. I'm pretty jolly, and we're recording this on December 20th, and this will be one of our last episodes of the year. And we are excited, though, to host a friend who we've met a little while ago. His name is Professor David Perlmutter, and he is with Texas Tech University. I think most of his appearances have been on Missing, but this time we are speaking with him on Crawlspace, obviously, about the disappearances and mysterious deaths of Kris Kremer and Lisanne Froon.
That's right. And while we say that we are excited to bring this conversation, I mean, we're certainly not excited to talk about the unfortunate, untimely deaths of these two young women. Kris Kremer was 21, Lisanne Froon was 22, and they were both from the Netherlands and were embarking on a teaching trip in Panama in 2014. Unfortunately, during a hike during their downtime, something happened during that 6-hour period, which became now, I think, the stuff of true crime legend. There are multiple dozens of pictures out there that people have really committed themselves to figuring out in terms of what these pictures mean. And that's what Dr. Perlmutter is bringing to the conversation here. He is a professor and an expert, and he teaches in the subject of interpreting what we see in the media versus real life and how we are processing that.
Yeah, this is really right up Dr. Perlmutter's alley, this conversation. And in fact, he brought the subject to us because I think he really enjoys sort of mixing it up with us. And we with him as well. So basically what you'll hear in this episode is us kind of going through some of the facts, some of the background on how they went missing and when they were found deceased, and how the internet interprets these disappearances and deaths.
And Tim, if folks wanted to listen to this episode without any of the commercial breaks, plus all of the other episodes that we've ever done during the holidays and not during the holidays, where would they find them? Would they find them underneath their Christmas tree?
Not exactly. Apple users can now subscribe to Crawlspace Premium on Apple Podcasts, and Crawlspace Premium is just the gift that keeps on giving and a perfect time of year to binge a lot of our catalog. You do get Missing in Dark Valley ad-free when you sign up for Crawlspace Premium, and you get our mostly weekly bonus show that we do, and you get early releases at times as well.
All right, we're going to break for one of those commercials, and we'll be right back with Dr. David Perlmutter and the story of Kris Kremer and Lisanne Froon.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. David Perlmutter. How are you today?
Very good, sir. How are you both?
Yeah, we're doing really well. Very much looking forward to this conversation. You're a regular now, one of the handful of guests that go through that rotating door, always bringing a really interesting conversation to the table. We love talking to you, but for those who do not know, can you please break down who you are and what brings you to the airways today?
Sure. My name is David Perlmutter, and I'm a professor at the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University in beautiful Lubbock, Texas. And for the last 30 years, I have studied visual persuasion. So I am interested in pictures and how they play a role in our lives, our culture, our history, our politics. I've done work such as first introduced me to you, where I rode along with the police department for 2 years, did a visual ethnography, and published a book about the role of police in the media, and this was more than 20 years ago. And since then, I've also done work on visual images in foreign policy, visual images in elections. Basically, I'm interested in how people perceive and understand visual images and how that can actually change the events that the pictures are of, or the perceptions of the events afterwards, basically how pictures and us interact. And I think the case we're going to be talking about today is a good case study to take a look.
I mean, it is about as textbook of a case study based on your description right there that we can try to wrap our minds around. There are a lot of visual images here. and very haunting too.
And is that something that you teach separately, or is that something that you include in your teachings on other things?
Well, I haven't actually taught an unsolved mysteries true crime class yet. I think that's something I'm working up to. I rather come in and out at the inflection point of certain famous cases. I think you and I first talked about the Maura Murray case, and I was interested as a journalism professor in media coverage because, as you know, almost all the unsolved or famous murder cases that have become so much part of our culture, whether it's podcasting or television or social media, they are an event, a crime or an alleged crime, a disappearance. And then there's the long, long tail of media coverage that can stretch over decades, even a century in some cases. That coverage obviously affects perception of people and sometimes can affect the outcome of the investigation in the case, and certainly who the public thinks is guilty or innocent, or maybe guilty or maybe innocent.
And then you just kind of come up to that crossroads where you have to make the decision, whether you like it or not as an individual consuming this, what you think happened and your impression of the person responsible or perhaps responsible, allegedly responsible, plus the survivors and the victims and the victims' families. So as a consumer of that, what do you typically tell people if they're like, I don't know what to do? I don't know how to process this information?
There's a basic principle of visual perception, which I do like to bring up to my students, which is the further you are away from something, the more simple it seems. As you get closer and closer and closer, a visual field becomes much more complex. So from 1,000 yards, you might just see, oh, there's some trees and it looks like a person. And then you get closer and, every tree is a different tree. And there's some leaves on that one. And there's a rabbit next to that one. And the person is complicated. They've got a scar and they're light. Just everything becomes more complicated. And of course, a lot of these cases, as you have proven over, how many episodes total have you done? 500 or more of?
Probably like 32,000.
Yeah, 500,000.
You haven't hit your 1 million mark, and I hope I'm a guest on that episode, by the way. Going back to Maura Murray, you did many, many episodes. Every time you look at it a different piece of evidence, a different perspective, a different allegation, another layer or tranche of complexity is added. At some point, as we've talked about, police are charged with making an arrest, and then an attorney general's office, a DA, is charged with getting a conviction. And that's often very different from media, right? From internet speculation or podcast speculation. And so those complexities have to be sorted out. And I think all of the cases that you've looked at, as I say, you guys, I think, are terrific for noting what we don't know and what we can't know and what we shouldn't say too much on because we just don't know enough yet. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that it's so easy to look at these cases and go, oh my gosh, did you see that her handbag was in her left hand, but she's right-handed? That means she must have been murdered. And you're thinking, no, sometimes people put their handbag in their left hand. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. And that's what we're going to try to unravel a little bit today.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be speaking about the wild case of Kris Kremer and Lisanne Froon, who went missing. They were students from the Netherlands in their young 20s, and they traveled to Panama and were on a hike when they went missing. And that's really where the mystery starts. They were not found again alive, but their backpack was found several weeks later with their phones in it, and their phones led to some really interesting data.
You have just said a few things. I think that's all we know. We always have to acknowledge that we're talking about just despicable, horrible situations and traumatized families. But it's interesting, in this case is another example where those few facts, I think, by the way, they had graduated with degrees. They were students of a kind. Once you go beyond that, if you go to Reddit, Kremer's Froon, or any of the other YouTube videos, you start seeing massive disputation, people with their own theories, a lot of them fighting. We've talked about a lot of these cases have, I won't say fan bases, but they have groups that tend to cluster around certain beliefs. Some of those beliefs are not just about my theory of how the murder took place, or my hypothesis rather, but it might be about whether a basic fact is true or not. Like, her backpack, was that backpack dropped by them? Did somebody place it there? Was it washed up by the river? We're going to talk about the photographs. Who took the pictures? Do we know they took the pictures? Were they alive when just everything is disputed.
I mean, right down to whether or not they were the victims of foul play or this was a hike that they embarked on that they got lost. And I believe Kris was asthmatic, so there might have been an incident there. And I think she also had a minor injury to her knee, so it might have been a little bit difficult for her to get out of a situation had they got lost in some rough terrain. So all of those questions pile on, and that alone would have been a mystery where people could really dig into and come up with a passionate answer that they could aggressively stand behind. But you toss in these pictures and then it just creates this layer of like, some people are so adamant that this is murder. But then if you look at it from another angle, you can put the pieces of the puzzle together. And if you're missing two or three, you can say, look at all of this evidence of these two young women who were murdered in Panama while on a hike. Or you could say, look at all this evidence of a tragic accident. And you can get two completely passionate sides, which I think is pretty much exactly in your wheelhouse.
Yes, and I want to talk about, first of all, there are some really great sources out there. A lot of amazing work has been done, whether it's on social media, the internet. There is a podcast, Lost in Panama, done by some professional journalists. They did a great job. I think they have a pretty strong hypothesis. You can disagree with it, but they actually went there and talked to people, which I always respect. I remember telling you guys how I respected that you actually went up to where Maura Murray disappeared and talked to humans. And what you do find is, there's two basic camps, is like the murdered and the lost. But then within that, all these pieces of evidence are disputed. And I just want to go back to a moment. We've discussed before the CSI effect, which is the expectation we, the public, have, having watched these procedural investigative programs, that technology within 43 minutes can solve any crime, right? We have a blurry picture. Hey, let's improve the resolution. Oh, there we go. We see that there's Joe with the gun, and I can read the serial number on the gun, and Joe is smiling, and he's got a piece of gum in his mouth, and that was the gum found in the scene. So, and then this fingerprint and this, just all the CSI stuff, which we know going back a few years, a lot of this technology like familial DNA. I mean, the DNA was there, but like the technology to go and convict somebody was not there. We know that not every police department has access to that technology. And we're talking about whether it's a rural New Hampshire Police Department or the Boulder Police Department back in the 90s, or in a very, very, very rural area of Panama, having access to the technology. There's one other example I want to bring up, and that is like just on a basic case of arguing about something. It is usually described that they went there, and by the way, I want to talk about them. They were young women. And the stereotype that we've been working with in our society for a long time is young women equal inexperienced or poor decision making or not mature. And of course, for those of us who actually know, like I know thousands of young women who are students here at Texas Tech and previous universities, that's not correct, right? You're not necessarily smarter or more mature at age 58 as a man than you are at 22 as a young woman. They were physically fit. They were highly intelligent. They graduated from difficult degrees. They worked. They were very enthusiastic. They had a lot of good traits. If I were going to be lost on the trail, I would rather be lost with them helping me than somebody my age in my physical condition, right? That's part of this stereotyping we have of when we look at things from a distance, we oversimplify them. So let's take one other thing, Spanish. One of the things you learn when you come out to West Texas, if you haven't lived someplace where there's large Hispanic populations, you realize really quickly that the word Spanish itself oversimplifies things. Because, for example, I have friends in Mexico who are educated university professors, and they will tell me that if they watch a program from Spain, like in Madrid Spanish, they will sometimes have to turn the subtitles on. Spanish is spoken differently in Argentina, in Chile, in northern Mexico, southern Mexico. This is an area where there are many people who are non-Europeans. There are people from different indigenous peoples, some of them not speaking Spanish, some of them speaking a different form of Spanish. So these young women are often described as, I hate to put it, like somehow they're ignorant and they're naive and they're innocent. They had some knowledge of Spanish. They wanted to learn more Spanish. But you know what? You could be fluent in Spanish and still go down there and have trouble communicating. I just wanted to get that point out there, is that we want to get past the idea of the helpless victim, or because they're young, they're stupid, and they're automatically going to make bad decisions, and we should look through that lens.
That's a really good point to make. And I think the second point that you made about the language and them being in an area where there's indigenous people, there comes that, I guess, preconceived notion as well, that these are like barbarians.
This is a tourist area. I mean, I think that's something else that needs to be brought out. The trail where they allegedly disappeared, the La Pianista, I'm probably not pronouncing it like the people there pronounce it. It's a tourist trail. I mean, there are tourist accommodations. It's not the edge of the known world where no one has ever seen somebody from the Netherlands or the United States. So we have all experienced, and we've talked about this before, you can get lost in the woods of Maine and never be found again. There are people who've disappeared in New York City, right? So it's not that this was an area people have not heard about, maybe, isn't necessarily the most important information. It's what actually happened to them in that situation, right? And that's where the visual evidence might come in for discussion.
Right. So it should be pointed out that their bones were discovered a couple months after they went missing. So they were both deceased. There was some skin attached to some of the bones. Pardon the disturbance of saying that. There's even some notes here that some bones appeared to have been bleached. So I think this is where we start to get into some odd areas of theory. I don't know why that is believed by some people.
And what does the word bleach mean, right? Because when I was looking this up, we use the word bleached, and does that mean like physically Clorox bleach versus you see bleached bones on the beach all the time, right, of sea animals? There was no murder. There was just the sun there, and the surf bleached them. When we get down to basic forensics of words, and the words that's why I brought up Spanish.
Yeah.
You know how difficult it is, even when you're fluent in a language. As an outsider, some term may mean something local that it doesn't mean in Texas versus New Hampshire.
Okay, so what we do know for sure is that their phones dialed the equivalent of 911 internationally. I guess it's 112. And so both phones attempted to call 112 about 6 hours into the hike. So something went wrong pretty quickly on the hike, you would think. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, although 6 hours is a long time.
Do we know how long they were planning on hiking for?
Again, this is something where I've seen different versions of this. I was under the impression that this was not an overnight. They didn't take camping gear. I don't think this is the kind of place where you would be encouraged as a tourist to just go into the jungle and see what happens. I did think at first that 6 hours seemed a long time to notice that you're in trouble. I mean, I would panic maybe 2 hours into not knowing where I am there. So there's a lot of questions about why that was such a long time. They call the international number that they would have known from Netherlands, which I think is 112. And then they call I guess Panama has the same as US 911. It's presumed that they did not have cell phone reception, so they weren't receiving anything. Although to me, it's, one of the many, many puzzles here is that you're always trying to think, like, what would you do? Like I would probably call my wife and leave a message, right? Because even if you're not getting cell phone reception, right, you should be. I don't know what the phones they were using back in 2014, but we remember that was 1,000 years ago, phone-wise, right? So there's a lot of questions there about those calls and what they meant. This immediately gets into that we just don't know. And as you said earlier, they had cameras and they took pictures. Now, again, here's where we get to what I would have done, what you would have done. I have been lost in the woods. We've talked about this before. You can panic very easily. I was lost in the woods once, and I mean, lost as in like I was probably 500 feet from the trail on a busy day, but I just lost, I got disoriented. And I didn't call search and rescue, but like I called a friend and I said, follow me and tell me where I am. And luckily I had cell reception. in 2014, probably in rural Panama, that wasn't available. But like the pictures, I was thinking about this, like if I was with a group, I would like take a picture of a person, like each other, like next to something recognizable, and then send it. Again, this is 2014. I know they had that technology to take a picture with your phone and send it of themselves. Didn't happen. There are some pictures, and we'll talk about that. Like there's a picture which seems to be the back of the head of Kris Kremer's. And like there's a massive internet discussion about what her head looks like. Was she alive when that was taken? What her hair looks like? We can get into that later.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Just want to give a little clarification about the pictures. When reading this through the lens of 2023, we're all assuming that they're taking pictures with their cell phones, but they had separate cameras.
Kremer's had an iPhone 4. This is just what I think is established. Kremer's, to clarify, Kremer's, because this is going to come up in the pictures, Kremer's was the redheaded one. So that's what this comes up a lot in the pictures. She's got very light redheaded hair. Her friend Froon was more, light blonde brunette. Kremer's had an iPhone 4 and Froon had a Galaxy S3. So they did have cell phones. I believe that they had cameras, though. They had physical cameras. And so most of the photographs we're talking about are the ones that were found on the physical camera.
Just to describe some of the camera roll, it starts off very normal, like exactly what you'd expect. Two friends on a hike. There is basically what you were describing, David, where it's one of them takes a photo of another one, and then there's like the hills in the distance and things like that. So they're kind of pausing at scenic spots on their hike. Then there's just a series of photos taken during the night with the flash on, is how I read that. And there's some sort of inanimate objects are being photographed, like sort of twigs on a rock. And then it seems like it's like shooting photos at the sky, almost like up or up into the side, because you see some trees, but you also seem to see raindrops that are bouncing off of the flash. And then there are some shots of a woman. I think it is a woman. It appears like Kremer's hair. I'm sure that's been debated.
Again, everything is disputed, but like what I'm seeing is that there were 90 flash pictures between 1 and 4 o'clock at night on April 8th. This is where, if you go on the internet, there's 100 theories. Like, why would somebody take 90 flash pictures of darkness? Were they trying to scare off an animal? If they were alive and they were lost, were they trying to signal? Maybe they saw an airplane or a helicopter. I mean, you can insert anything into this. Maybe somebody else was just trying to cycle through the camera. This is one of those things where I don't think you're going to find one simple theory that definitively explains that. Now, if you go online, there's a lot of people who have credibility as photography experts. Of course, nowadays, you don't have to be a professional photographer to be really good at understanding photography, who analyze those pictures, like 40 minutes for one picture, trying to identify the location. And you know how hard that is. Let's go back to the Patterson-Gimlin film, right? The famous alleged film of Bigfoot. The place now is completely different for those people who visited there, right? I think it looked like it was probably different a couple months later. Terrain changes, jungle especially. Jungle doesn't look the same 5 weeks later. People have identified and said, well, this is an opening of a cave. You were mentioning the rocks. This is a ledge. This is near a pass, a particular pass. And you have really good people with some level of expertise completely disagreeing. And then worse, there's allegations of photoshopping, that some of the pictures have been altered for the analysis. Now, of course, as we talked about in the CSI shows, they alter pictures all the time. In order to study them, they go closer in or blow them up. So alteration is not in itself falsification, but it's what you claim about and explain of the altering that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it really struck me as a technique that the two women had, as you described, to get them through the night, perhaps. Like if they were walking along and it was dark and they needed the flash to take a picture of the terrain, just to look at the terrain and say, like, is it going to drop off a ledge? Is it going to be muddy or something? They could look at the picture. Maybe there was a sound in the woods. Maybe they took a picture to see what was out there. It just seemed like a device to get through the night. I think anything other than that is kind of going a little too far down the speculative road. That's a really interesting point you made about alteration of images in an investigation isn't exactly falsification, which is really interesting because I think it's a real fine line to walk right there. But the problem is these pictures are now easily accessible on Reddit, and anybody can take these, put them into Photoshop and change the time code, or just put a new time code on it, put something in the background, just start a whole new wave of speculation and rumors.
I suppose someone could do that, but at least these have been out there as is now for years, so maybe that would be obvious if someone was doing that now. I think that's totally possible that they're using it for light because it seems pitch black out there in the middle of the jungle at night, but I don't know that that accounts for all of the photographs.
Yeah, probably not all of them.
Right, so then what is like the close-up of the back of, it looks like Kremer's head.
Maybe they were checking her head for bugs or ticks or something. Maybe she had something that she thought was biting her.
Well, one of the claims is that she may have had an injury. And some people claim they see an injury in the photo. I mean, I don't, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I think that's the point, is stepping back. Multiple explanations explain part of the evidence. It's hard to come up with one explanation that explains all of the evidence. And that's what's so frustrating about so many of these cases, right? We can have theories and parts of them can be all true, or none of them are true, and we just don't know the exact facts. For example, one of the theories is that they were murdered, right? And that's at some point along their hike, they were intercepted, something happened. I mean, there's a lot of allegations about what the initial interaction may not have been somebody stalking them to kill them. It may have been something else. And then it led to, it could have been deliberate murder. It could have been accidental, somebody's trying to rob them and it leads to death. I mean, all the different scenarios, but that might have happened at any time. So they may have been lost and then they met the wrong person, which we know has happened in many cases. People were just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and one bad thing led to another bad thing. We don't have a CSI clean narrative where somebody's sitting there going at 1:52 this happened. I mean, and just one example is that, just again looking at some of the things which don't seem to be disputed, is that the Samsung Galaxy 3 Froon's camera battery is empty April 4th. Now, again, you think today, boy, if I went into the jungle today, I would have one of those lithium backups, 900-hour backups. I wouldn't go. But of course, back then, probably, I don't think people, I was a photographer at that time, and we did have battery. You only had battery backup if you were a professional photographer. And those things were big, heavy wedding photography, so you don't want to run out of your camera juice. Kremer's phone, the iPhone 4, not switched off finally until April 11, and it had 22% battery left. I mean, that's another puzzle, right? Is like, if you have 22% battery left and you're still alive, I would keep trying making phone calls, unless you're stuck in one place because one of them is injured. Again, all these different theories to explain why. Does that mean that they weren't alive or they weren't in control of their phone? Lots of theories.
Yeah, I can see why there's so many. Between April 5th and April 6th, the iPhone was turned on and the signal was checked, but the PIN number was not entered correctly into the phone. And that is Kremer's phone. So that makes me think that wasn't Kremer's with the phone because the PIN wasn't entered correctly. But what is really mysterious about that is that, as you mentioned, the phone was shut off for the last time there on April 11th. It wasn't turned on at all between April 7th and 10th. So that's 4 days where I thought they would have been in the jungle maybe, or one of them would have been, or someone is apparently, because someone has the phone, but they're not checking for signal for 4 days, even though there is battery.
There is a certain logic that, like, if you're lost, you're going to be using your electronics to try to help yourself, right? With the independent variable of you may be panicking, you may be in a situation where somebody's hurt, and that may be interfering with your decision making. Weather, being stuck out in the jungle, cold at night, mosquitoes, all these things, right? But would you forget your own PIN number at some point? Two people traveling together, I've never seen this written down. I'm assuming when people are traveling together, they know each other's PIN number by then. I don't know. I've never shared my wife knows my PIN number. Would I share it with a good friend I'm going camping where I'm going outdoors with? But there does seem to be this issue that maybe at some point that they definitely had their own phones, and then at some point somebody else had their phone. But that doesn't mean that that's somebody who murdered them, right? That may very well be somebody who found a phone, couldn't be used because they didn't have the PIN number and they weren't break into a phone in rural Panama out of that technology, disposed of it, didn't want to get in trouble. I mean, we know a lot of cases somebody is not murdered by the people who find something, but they don't want to get involved. You can imagine in whether it's in New York City or in rural Panama, people may know something, which the Lost in Panama podcast definitely alleges, but they just don't want to get involved, or they're afraid.
With the phone being turned on, Chris's phone being turned on and the PIN being entered incorrectly, it seemed like whoever was doing it had some sort of pattern or something was determined in their head that I'm going to do it around this time and around this time, because it was similar times, right? It was around like 10:30 to 10:50 and then almost the exact time, like 1:37 or something, where the phone was turned on and the PIN was entered incorrectly. I wonder how many times back then a PIN had to be entered incorrectly before it locked the phone out. What I'm thinking is one of them was not able to use the phone for whatever reason. And in order to try to communicate to the outside world, there had to be almost rationing of the phone batteries between the two phones. And then for how long is that phone locked out? Because Tim, you had mentioned that there were a few days. If the phone got locked out and they had to, for that phone, they had to wait a few days.
I mean, I owned an iPhone 1, so I have some memory. I think even back then, it was like 3 or 4 attempts would lock you out for a certain amount of time. If I was just wandering around and I found somebody's phone, I would definitely turn it on to see maybe there's a picture of somebody that I can post on Facebook. I actually had this happen to me. I was in an airport 3 days ago. I just saw somebody's phone left on a chair there. And I looked around and there just wasn't anybody around. I actually said, anybody lose their phone? And a plane was boarding. So I actually called out to like 70 people boarding. Anybody forget their phone? Nobody came up. So I took the phone to the airline counter and they said, we can't take possession of it. Just leave it where you found it. I guess because of legal issues or something. They don't have a lost and found. I guess if I'd gone to the airport itself, maybe they don't have lost and founds anymore. I know that there's some places don't do that anymore. So I just left the phone there. I did turn it on thinking, hey, maybe there'll be a picture there that I can take a picture of it and put it on Facebook or something, or, I just found your phone, whoever you are. But I didn't want, what would you do? Like, I was thinking, should I take it with me and then mail it to somebody? I really didn't know what to do.
Wow.
But I did turn it on. But I wouldn't have thought to try to get into it because it had a PIN number and how many, 1,000 combinations, right? So I wasn't going to 11111. Okay, it opens. If you were experienced with cell phones, would you even try to get in?
It's a great question. I was thinking that myself. And it says either no PIN or a wrong PIN was entered. So I'm not sure how many wrong entries there were. I probably would try it a couple of times just out of panic, out of desperation, and then realize, obviously, there's no way I'm going to guess this. Maybe it was the same reason for the flash. Maybe it was used for light at a certain point. I know a lot of people use their phones for light now.
Yeah, I feel like, though, if you're with a friend and your friend might be not able to use the phone, not able to answer you, maybe their birthday, so you try that. Give it a couple of shots and then shut the phone down to preserve the battery.
Right. Well, we've talked about this in the past. If you go online, there's some fantastic articles out there about what to do if you're lost in the woods, what you should actually do in terms of a sequence of events, and how people who've studied lost people or people who are in the woods lost, they often do none of these things or very few of these things or not enough of these things. Some people get found and they talk about, like in my case, I'm getting lost in the woods. I find out 500 feet from the trail. But when you're 500 feet from the trail, it's the same thing as being 20 miles from the trail when you are personally lost. We can always speculate what somebody could do, should do, but at the end of the day, no behavior is strange when you're panicking. And this is like a couple of days where the first no pin, April 5th. So we're talking about 4 or 5 days into getting lost in the jungle in Panama as a foreigner. I personally would not be making a lot of rational decisions at that time. So a lot of this is just not explainable by us now. Going back to the pictures for a minute, what I find interesting again is that as we've talked about before, human beings are very visual animals, right? Like we're not as good as some parts of vision. Like we don't have the night vision that cats do. We don't have the literally eagle eye of predatory birds, but we're pretty good utility knives. The human beings are the Swiss Army knife of the animal kingdom. We're sort of good at a lot of things. We can run long distances and we can sprint, whereas some animals, like famously cats, are really great sprinters, but they're not long distance runners, things like that. So we're not over specialized like a lot of animals, but our visual field is very important to us. We're really visual animals. We make decisions very quickly based upon looking at somebody. People meet somebody the first time and they make a decision. Is this a good person? Is this a bad person? In 5 seconds. And so I think the problem with that is that we've been trained by evolution to make decisions very, very quickly about visual data because we had to, right? We had to make very, very quick life or death decisions. The issue becomes in our society that people will look at a picture and they'll make a decision right away about what something means without thinking through all the possibilities of alternate explanations of that picture. So going back to what appears on first glance to be the back of the head of one of the young women, right? And going online, I gave up after 300 or 400 individual YouTube videos, posts, comments. I mean, if you want to get in the comments, we're in the tens of thousands about why you take a picture of somebody's head, what that head looks like, what the hair looks like. Is it messy? Is it just they've been in the jungle a couple of days, or does it look like it? Is that a living person? Again, I don't consider myself a visual expert. I mean, I've been taking photographs and looking at photographs for 30 years, but I look at that picture and I can't tell you some of the things that other people are concluding with great surety about that. I just don't know looking at that picture. And I think that's what's very interesting is a lot of people have made up their mind, but they've made up their mind in completely different directions about this one picture, the most famous picture probably that came out of this case.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
I see no injury. I'm not, unless I'm looking at the wrong photo. I don't know where an injury is supposed to be on the back of the person's head in the photograph.
I think if you look hard enough, you'll see what you want to see. Again, that's not attacking anybody who comes to that theory. Maybe they're seeing something that I don't see. It's possible, but I don't think it would be proven in the court of law. Let's put it that way.
Using the photos up because they encountered some bad actor who's just trying to get rid of the photos. That was my first thought. And I think some of these are out of order where I'm looking at them. But if that was the case, they would all been taken right in a row, all back, as quick as possible, you would think, not spaced out like these appear to be. I also think it's weird, like, it doesn't seem like both young women could have been there because of the no pin, So I'm confused. At some point, it seems like, to me, one of them got hurt or something, I guess Kremer's, and she wasn't able to enter a pin and Froon didn't know the pin. That's what I take out of this.
If we think about what fictional genre are we talking about? If you were writing a movie script, this is found footage, right? This is found footage. And we are familiar, I guess famously, the Blair Witch Project and Cloverfield, a subgenre often of science fiction, often of horror, of found footage. And typically that found footage tells a story. And this is found footage where it doesn't tell a story. There's no simple story. There's no complicated story. Nobody was trying to tell anything with these pictures that we can discern. There's no signals. Right now, some people have claimed like they can see like some sticks arranged, or that, something in the picture was a message. But then you think, like, if I'm trying to send a message, I can like draw in the dirt or like rub dirt on a rock. But again, I'm panicking. I'm in the jungle. Who knows? But I think this is where we're resistant as human beings to having this found footage, knowing that CSI should be able to work. The evidence doesn't fit anything simple and clear like a really good found footage movie.
And I want to get your opinion on this. What do you think of the psychology that goes behind these pictures? What do you think about how people consider the individual's situation and the psychology that goes behind them? Because we've said it a couple of times, when you're in this situation, you're lost, you're panicking. But I think in the beginning parts of getting lost, it takes a little while for people to admit to themselves that they're lost. And now we have to start going into some sort of survival mode when we weren't expecting to. And crossing that line means one step closer to not only getting rescued, but it's one step closer to perhaps we're going to die out here. Working that in your head contributes to what pictures you're taking and when. Do you think people take that into consideration?
That's a really important point. And again, if you read some of these good studies that have been done by academics and park rangers and people who work in wilderness areas in search and rescue, they'll talk about the pride factor. Admitting that you're lost is like step one to being found. And that a lot of people get lost, sort of know that they're lost, but then keep going, not admitting that they're lost, and thus get more lost. I don't know whether any particular group is more susceptible to that. I think everybody is. Again, 6 hours to me is a long time to go on a day hike and not know where you are. But at what point did they realize that like other tourists or a camp or a cafe was not just around the corner? Was one of them hurt very early? I mean, one of the theories is that one of them fell down the side of a cliff. One of them fell down and was hurt. The other one went and possibly got hurt as well. And so very early on, they weren't in a position to make any good decisions because they couldn't. They were stuck where they were, and they weren't getting cell phone reception. Nobody heard them. Famously, Jody Huisentruit, the disappearance of Josie Huisentruit, still missing. I was a professor at University of Iowa, probably one of the most famous missing, definitely presumed murdered case in Iowa. People heard in her apartment building, you have the testimony, I heard a woman screaming, help, or I'm being attacked, or some version of that, and nobody did anything. Nobody called the police, nobody came out, which a lot of us would be puzzled at that, but that happens all the time. We don't know, for example, who was in possession of those cameras. Nothing may have happened to them in terms of like murder. They may have suffered an accident and lost their camera, and somebody else comes and finds their camera, and so they're hurt somewhere, and somebody else has their camera, but the two things have nothing to do with each other, right? Again, we are creating these plus signs when we don't know that 1 + 1 + 1 has some equation. We don't know whether this is an equation or these are just parallel diverging tracks. That's what I'm always fascinated about, is how little we know that we think we know. And that how, if you look at any picture, again, this is sort of a visual perception principle, is that the longer you look at something, the more you think you understand it.
I will say I am a bit confused about the one with the twig, and it seems like wrappers. I've been looking at this one for a few minutes now, zooming in. It was like someone ripped up a piece of paper, it looks like, around the twig with the leaves. I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of that means. Can't draw any conclusion, but very haunting imagery. What do people in your class say? Like, how do these conversations go in your class?
When I have shown these pictures, this case is well known, but not so well known that the average 18-year-old would have a strong opinion about it or have heard about it. So, for example, if you grow up in our culture today, you are more likely, I think, at age 18 to know about Maura Murray than you are about JonBenet Ramsey. Because, of course, JonBenet Ramsey, it's still in the news, and you can still go on social media and there's still people talking about JonBenet Ramsey, but like most of my students were not on this earth when the JonBenet Ramsey happened. Maura Murray, as we famously discussed, was really the first great unsolved case of the social media era. The average 18-year-old may know more about that case than the Lindbergh kidnapping or the Black Dahlia murders or something like that. The podcasts have really helped change that. And especially when you meet younger people or older people who are true crime, they've learned about cases, not through the news, but through podcasts. What I will do is I will show these pictures. I mean, they know that this is the week that we're talking about visual evidence and true crime and things like that. But I will not frame them. I'll not say these are pictures from the case of these. I will just, have you seen these pictures before? And I would say only 10 to 15% of the students recognize the pictures. And when I ask them, where do you recognize them from? They will say, well, it was from a YouTube video, a podcast, and I then went and looked up things. So it's not because they had any connection to the case, but there'll be one or two students who are really true crime aficionados, and they'll say, oh yeah, I took a deep dive into these pictures. And maybe that population is artificially high because we are a college of communications, and like all of our students learn basic photography and videography. But then when I ask people to tell me what they see, again, they might say something like, oh yeah, wasn't there like a murder in South America or something like that? They didn't listen to 17 podcasts. Maybe they listened to half of one. Their understanding of pictures is framed by what they know. And if they don't know anything, they don't really see that much. So talking about the twig and the wrapper picture, they see a twig and a wrapper. They don't see anything of ominous. I'm not saying anything negative, but you said, I think you would use the word ominous or sinister or something like that.
Haunting.
Like, haunting, yeah. But if we don't know that it's associated with death, is it haunting or is it somebody took a picture of a twig and a wrapper, right? If I went through your entire camera roll.
No, I would argue it's a boring photo if it's not associated with this case.
I think saying twig and a wrapper, even if you present it like that, people are seeing a wrapper. You know what I mean? It might not be a wrapper. It might not be a twig.
Right. That's one of my big takeaways for the students, is that the meaning of pictures is often not in the picture, it's in the caption. I mean, we can see that every day, where if you label a dead body as this is these people who were killed by these people, people may have a completely different opinion just based upon the captioning. It's not actually on the picture itself. And there's a lot of really good scholarship beyond whatever I've done about visual truth. There's a famous line from an art historian named E.H. Gombrich, and he said, pictures can lie, but not in the same way words can lie. And so the example we would have is, from my generation, is I walked into a theater when I was much younger, and I saw rolling titles that said to me that the images I'm about to see were from long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. I did not feel cheated because, like, wait a minute, why are these people speaking English? And like, how did they get this film footage from this galaxy? The captioning contextualized these images and we just rolled with it. Blair Witch Project, on the other hand, I'm old enough to remember this was the early days of the internet. When I first heard about Blair Witch Project, I mean, I picked up on it pretty quickly and I was informed pretty quickly. I went like, oh, is that a thing? Like there were these kids and they found their footage and things like that. I mean, they talk about the naive audience, like the early days of film before people caught on with all the tropes and the techniques of film, like cutting somebody's head off, like we're this disembodied body, right? People understand we're not like cut off completely, right? But my point being that a lot of what we think we see in an image comes from what we're told about the image. That's what you see when people describe it. Because when I say this is of somebody who may have been murdered, and you see this red hair, then you start going, wow, does that look like a bruise there? And why is it so messy? And like, oh my God, she must have been. We make all of these inferences.
And is it for the good or not to make these inferences?
Well, again, you've done a fantastic job over the years in addressing many cases where no attention has been paid. Like you've done some really wonderful episodes about the disappearance or death of indigenous women in Canada, in the United States, and you've talked about how not enough attention is being paid to these killings, right? They don't get as much attention as a Gabby Petito or a Maura Murray. That's not taking away from the tragedy of the death of people like that, but like, as we've talked about before, some victims are more important in the media script than others. And you've done this amazing job of going beyond the top 20 to the forgotten 500 in terms of missing and murder. You could argue that it's always good to keep some level of attention so that a case is not forgotten. But then when people start going off in directions that the evidence doesn't really support, I mean, they could be right, but the evidence isn't actually there, then you do worry that they're just confusing things so much. I mean, one of the things you've talked about this, I think I wasn't on the show, but you've talked about, like, you know, if somebody's ever caught in some of these famous cases, where are you going to find a jury? The answer is no. I haven't heard anything about this case. I don't have I don't have a strong opinion on it. A local jury in that county, in that particular county in New Hampshire, where Maura Murray disappeared, how are you going to find a jury who can say, no, I've never heard of this case, or I don't have an opinion on this case? I'm guessing a lot of local people have an opinion on the case.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think they were having trouble in the Delphi case for that same reason. Dr. David Perlmutter, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation, and really appreciate you joining us here to have it.
Well, thank you. And again, thanks for the work that you do. And I really do want to shout out, a lot of people have done amazing work in studying these images, and you can learn a lot about how photography works, especially in digital cameras. And there's some people who are bringing in all of these contexts and talking about, like, what happens when you blow up a picture, or color, or lighting, or shading, or size and perspective. So you can learn a lot about pictures just through this case. And of course, we hope one day that there will be some resolution of what exactly happened, and the pictures will play a role in that solution, I believe.